exists a psychological phenomenon rarely discussed in depth psychology literature, yet instantly recognizable to those who experience it: the persistent, often secret conviction of being chosen for something undefined but significant. Not the grandiose delusion of psychosis, nor simple narcissistic inflation, though it shares surface features with both, something else entirely. This feeling has been magnified and distorted by cultural narratives. Modern cinema and drama relentlessly recycle what can be called the chosen one archetype, a pattern distinct from, but related to what Jung and Campbell identified as the hero's journey. The hero is called to transform through ordeal and returns changed. The chosen one is selected by destiny, often marked from birth, special before proving anything. This is the prophet archetype, sometimes with a heroic touch, the messianic complex, the one fate has singled out. Neo, Harry Potter, Paul Atreides, Anakin Skywalker. These narratives resonate because they reflect something genuine in the collective unconscious, the self calling the ego toward transformation, but they function as psychological metaphor, not literal instruction. When the archetype is literalized, when one mistakes internal psychological drama for external cosmic destiny, the result is confusion at best, pathological inflation at worst. This confusion has been further amplified by mystical and pop psychology content that validates chosen one identity without psychological grounding. Videos and frameworks telling people they are special, they are destined, the universe has selected them. Mass inflation without the counterbalance of depth work. This podcast attempts what those cultural narratives and superficial takes cannot: rigorous psychological examination of what's actually happening when certain minds feel chosen. Those who carry this feeling have learned not to speak it aloud. It sounds too grandiose, too close to the delusions one spends a lifetime proving one doesn't possess. Yet the narrative persists, that one's difference, the way one perceives patterns invisible to others, the depth one cannot moderate, the symbolic dimension of reality one inhabits while most people live on surfaces, must mean something. That one has been chosen somehow for something one cannot yet name. The internal question becomes inescapable: am I delusional, or am I actually special? This podcast proposes a third answer, one grounded in Jungian depth psychology. What if the chosen one experience is neither delusion nor cosmic selection, but a signal from the psyche itself, indicating the gap between one's current fragmentation and one's potential wholeness? I recently explored this phenomenon in a video that examines the personal, psychological dimensions of this experience. What follows goes deeper into the archetypal foundations, the cultural inflation, and the philosophical distinctions that video format cannot hold. Consider this the extended director's cut for those willing to sit with complexity. If you haven't watched the video yet, you can find the link in the description. The mechanism: why certain minds feel chosen. Carl Jung discovered that the psyche operates as a self-regulating system. Like the body maintaining homeostasis through temperature regulation and chemical balance, the psyche compensates for psychological imbalances. It sends signals when something is fundamentally wrong, when one is living as a fraction of oneself. The chosen one feeling is one of those signals. Jung's typological work identified certain cognitive configurations particularly susceptible to this experience. He called them introverted intuitives, minds whose primary orientation is inward and whose perception operates through pattern recognition and symbolic processing rather than concrete sensory data. In modern typology frameworks, these configurations commonly manifest as INFJ and INTJ, dominant introverted intuition. Two other types share the essential architecture: depth-oriented introversion with intuition as a primary perceptual function, though not as the dominant, INFP and INTP. While they lead with introverted feeling or thinking respectively, their auxiliary extroverted intuition creates the same fundamental orientation toward pattern recognition, symbolic processing, and meaning-making over concrete immediacy. Together, these four types, INFJ, INTJ, INFP, INTP, constitute what can be called the deep intuitives, consciousness structured for depth rather than surface, abstraction rather than concreteness, the symbolic dimension rather than the literal. These minds, the deep intuitives, acknowledging that the label captures something broader than four-letter codes, share a peculiar burden. When there exists a significant gap between who one is consciously and who one is in totality, when major parts of the self remain unconscious, repressed, split off in shadow, the psyche registers this fragmentation. It knows one is capable of wholeness, but living in pieces. The response is pressure, a pull, a restlessness, a sense that one is meant for something more. And one is meant for something more, but not in the way the ego imagines. Not external destiny or cosmic mission. Psychological completeness. Jung called this individuation, the journey toward becoming one's actual self, not one's ego ideal, not society's version, but one's total integrated psychological reality. The engine running heart. Jung's concept of psychic libido, psychological energy, not sexual drive, varies dramatically between individuals in both intensity and direction. Deep intuitives typically demonstrate what Jung termed high introverted libido, massive concentrations of psychic energy flowing inward, toward the unconscious, toward symbols, toward meaning-making. This explains the phenomenon's characteristic features, why dreams arrive more vivid, more archetypal, more insistent, why synchronicities seem to multiply, why the pull toward something more operates with relentless intensity, not because one is chosen by fate, but because one's psychological engine runs hotter than average, generating more pressure, more communication from the unconscious, more urgent demands for consciousness. And because this high libido activates archetypal layers of the psyche, the experience carries numinous weight. The chosen one isn't merely personal fantasy, it's an archetype from the collective unconscious, the same pattern that appears across cultures as prophet, savior, messiah. When one's psychic energy constellates this archetype, it feels cosmically significant, because archetypal energy always does. But as established earlier, the archetype functions as psychological metaphor for the self, calling the ego toward transformation, not literal instruction that one has been externally selected. That energy must go somewhere. It can flow toward individuation, integrating shadow, becoming whole, answering the psyche's teleological drive toward completeness. Or it turns destructive, inflation, grandiosity, neurosis, fantasy, addiction, paralysis. The chosen one feeling, viewed through this lens, is high libido with nowhere to go. Psychic pressure building because one is not directing it toward the actual work the depths demand. The cultural void, initiation without elders. Traditional societies possessed frameworks for this experience. When someone reported vivid dreams, synchronicities, a sense of being called towards something undefined, the culture had containers, shamanic initiation, religious vocation, mystery school training, vision quests. There were elders who recognized the signs, rituals that channeled the energy, communities that understood. This person is being summoned by something deeper than ego, and they require guidance through the descent. Modernity provides no such framework. The deep intuitive experiences the psyches call in isolation, with no interpretive structure except those the culture offers. Mental illness, narcissism, or New Age fantasies about manifestation and cosmic destiny. None address what's actually happening psychologically. The result? Oscillation between inflation, thinking one is special, and shame, thinking one is delusional. Between waiting for external validation of one's calling and doubting the calling exists at all. The psyche still demands transformation, but there's no cultural structure to hold one through it. No elders to say, yes, this is real, and here's what it means. No community of others walking the same path. Individuation occurs anyway, but in isolation, which is simultaneously what the process requires and why it feels like drowning while being ignored. The shadow, when chosen, becomes pathological. Not everyone who feels chosen is individuating, some are merely inflated. The distinction matters. The narcissist experiences the chosen one feeling as confirmation of superiority. They're special, different, elevated above others. The feeling serves the ego. It separates. It justifies why they deserve recognition, validation, what they're owed. The person genuinely responding to the psyche's call experiences it as burden and necessity. Not, I'm better than others, but, I cannot ignore this anymore. Not superiority, but compulsion. Jung described individuation not as choice, but as something that seized him, demanded everything, isolated him, and he resented it even as he couldn't refuse. The diagnostic question, where does the energy go? The narcissist uses the chosen feeling to avoid actual work. They position themselves as guru, teacher, the one who already has it figured out, while their shadow remains untouched, their wounds unintegrated, their ego inflated beyond capacity. The individuating person uses the feeling as fuel for descent, into shadow, into the parts they've been avoiding, into uncomfortable, unglamorous work of becoming whole rather than special. There exists a particular trap for those fluent in depth language, using psychological sophistication to avoid psychological work. One can discuss shadow integration beautifully without ever facing one's actual shadow. Philosophize about authenticity while living inauthentically in ways one has made invisible to oneself. This is spiritual bypassing in Jungian terminology, seductive precisely because deep intuitives excel at this level of abstraction. But the psyche doesn't care about theoretical understanding. It demands actual integration. And actual integration is messy, slow, humiliating, done largely in private with no one watching. The question that cuts through bypass is one using the chosen one feeling to wait for recognition or to fuel work no one will ever see. The reframe, chosen by one's depths. The truth, one is the chosen one, not in the way one imagined. Not chosen by fate, universe, destiny, not here to fulfill grand external purpose that will finally make one's difference make sense. Chosen by one's own depths, by one's own unconscious, by the self, that totality of who one could become if one stopped abandoning oneself to fit in, stay safe, remain acceptable. Jung discovered this through experience. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Precisely what has been happening. The psyche's demand for wholeness, projected outward, mistaken for cosmic purpose. One's own depths, externalized, waiting for the universe to give back what already lives inside. When this recognition occurs, when one understands the energy originates internally, not from external forces, everything shifts. The power returns. As long as one believes the chosen feeling emanates from outside, one remains passive, waiting, interpreting signs, seeking external confirmation. All that psychic energy, high libido, intensity, drive, leaking outward into projection. But understanding it as internal, realizing one's psyche is calling toward wholeness, and that call is real, urgent, non-negotiable, all power returns. Every bit of energy spent waiting for recognition converts to usable force. The person who transforms, creates, genuinely impacts their world isn't waiting for cosmic permission. They're using their energy. This is the shift from passive to active. From am I chosen to what will I create with this intensity? From what is my purpose to what does my psyche demand I become? From when will my destiny reveal itself to what happens when I direct this energy consciously toward my own completion? The paradox, ordinariness as wholeness. Individuation makes one more ordinary, not less. The fantasy of being chosen carries inflation, a sense of specialness that separates one from others, that makes one different in cosmically significant ways. The ego cherishes this. It gives meaning to suffering, purpose to isolation, dignity to being misunderstood. Actual individuation requires sacrificing this narrative, not one's genuine difference. Deep intuitives are wired differently. Their psychic libido does run higher. Their pattern recognition does operate at levels most don't access. That's structural reality. What must be sacrificed is the meaning made from the difference. The narrative that suffering makes one special, that depth elevates, that being misunderstood proves one operates on higher frequency. Jung observed, individuation makes one peculiarly yourself, more genuinely who one actually is than any other process could. But paradoxically, becoming uniquely oneself also makes one more ordinary, more human, more connected to fundamental patterns all humans share. Wholeness isn't about being special, it's about being complete. There's strange relief when one abandons the chosen one narrative, not relief of lowered standards, but relief of no longer needing cosmic significance. One can simply be, flawed, ordinary in one's extraordinariness, doing the work not because fate demands it, but because one's psyche won't permit any other way. The mentor, healer, guide, these emerge not from fantasy of being chosen, but from having completed one's own work, after descending into shadow, after integrating what was disowned, after becoming whole enough to hold space for others without using them to avoid one's own depths. This is why genuine teachers often don't feel chosen. They feel compelled. Jung described individuation as something that seized him, not something he sought. Uncomfortable, isolating, demanding everything. That's the signature of authenticity. Not I'm special, but I cannot not do this. The actual work. What does answering the psyche's call actually require? First, stop waiting for external validation. One's perception is legitimate because it's one's way of interfacing with reality, not because others confirm it. This doesn't mean one is always right. It means trusting one's knowing enough to test it, use it, let it guide, while remaining open to error. Second, Live authentically, accepting the cost. Inauthenticity is no longer tolerable once the psyche rejects it. Relationships will end. Opportunities will close. Versions of oneself one thought one would become will die. One does it anyway because the alternative, continuing self-betrayal, becomes worse. Third, honor the rhythm of withdrawal and return. Stop apologizing for needing solitude. Build life that allows descent into reflection, into the unconscious, into integration. Then return with what's been discovered. Not as hermit, but as someone who understands depth requires time away from noise. Fourth, face one's shadow, not theoretically, actually. The parts deemed unacceptable, aggression, desire, pettiness, selfishness, turn toward them instead of running. Bring them into consciousness. Integrate them without acting them out. This is the alchemical work, done mostly in private, in darkness, unwatched. Dreams and synchronicities function as navigation, not mystical signs from universe, but communications from one's own unconscious, revealing what consciousness avoids, what shadow demands integration, what potential tries to emerge. This path is lonely, not because one is better than others, but because genuinely individuating while culture rewards adaptation and surface-level connection creates isolation. Most won't understand why one needs solitude, cannot moderate intensity, takes everything so deeply, so symbolically. They'll call it dramatic, overthinking, too sensitive, too much. One does the work anyway. Not for recognition, not for validation, not even for people one will eventually help after integrating one's own depths. One does it because one's psyche permits nothing else. Conclusion. The third option. Delusion, real specialness, or something different? The chosen one feeling isn't delusion. The psyche genuinely calls toward wholeness, toward integration, toward becoming the totality of who one actually is. But it's not external specialness either. Not chosen by fate for cosmic mission. Not here to save the world or fulfill grand destiny that will finally make suffering meaningful. Chosen by one's own depths. By the self that knows one is capable of wholeness, but living in fragments. By the unconscious that won't stop pushing toward consciousness, regardless of discomfort. This is simultaneously harder and more liberating than either delusion or specialness. Harder because no one validates it. No external force confirms one is on the right path. No cosmic parent declares one special and promises everything will make sense eventually. More liberating because all energy previously projected outward, all waiting for recognition, for permission, for signs, returns as power, as fuel, as force needed to actually do the work of becoming whole. The real, chosen ones? They didn't feel chosen. They felt compelled, seized by something they couldn't refuse even when they wanted to. They did the work in darkness, without witnesses, without recognition, because the alternative, living as fraction of themselves, became unbearable. That's what one is feeling. Not delusion, not special. Necessity. One's psyche calling one home to oneself. The only question remaining, what will be done with it? This work is reader-supported. If you found value here, you can support it on Ko-Fi or explore the store. Links below. And for more explorations of depth psychology for deep intuitives, subscribe to my Substack, The Hidden Chamber. You'll find the link in the description. Thanks for listening.